dad kissing my mom's best friend.
I remember the sound of the glass breaking first. Sharp, clear, slicing through the jazz music and laughter like a blade. Everyone turned for a second, curious, then went back to their wine and small talk. Only I knew what I had seen. Only I knew why my hands were shaking. Behind the bar, hidden half in shadow, my father was kissing my mother's best friend. Not a polite peck, or an awkward slip. No. It was deliberate, familiar. The kind of kiss that belonged to two people who had crossed a line long ago. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My brain refused to process it. I must have been standing there for a full 10 seconds, frozen, the stem of the broken wine glass still in my hand, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it over the music. This was their 30th wedding anniversary party. We'd spent weeks planning it. Mom wanted everything perfect. The white string lights across the backyard. The photo slideshow playing softly on the patio TV. The tables lined with navy blue linens and silver candles. Simple elegance, she called it. That was her style, quiet grace. Dad had insisted on inviting all their friends from church, from the community board, and of course, Suzanne, Mom's best friend since college. I'd grown up calling her Aunt Susan. She was always around, helping plan dinners, helping choose decorations, helping, apparently, in more ways than I'd imagined. The jazz band started a slow tune. The Way You Look Tonight, Dad's favorite. He was supposed to be dancing with Mom, but Mom was across the yard, chatting politely with the neighbors, smiling that effortless smile that people admired. She had no idea, I thought. Or maybe she did. I took a step back, praying that I'd imagined it. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, a kiss on the cheek that looked wrong from this angle. But then Susan laughed softly, touched Dad's tie, and whispered something into his ear that made him grin like a teenager. That's when I knew. I set the glass down before it shattered completely and looked toward Mom. She was watching me, not them, me. Our eyes met across the crowd. For a moment, I thought she'd read everything in my face. The shock, the disgust, the heartbreak. But instead of confusion or pain, she gave me a smile. A calm, knowing smile. The kind that says, I already know. I started toward her, my throat tight, ready to whisper the truth in her ear. But before I could speak, she lifted her champagne flute slightly, a gesture of elegance so natural that no one else noticed, and whispered just loud enough for me to hear as I reached her. The best part's coming. Then she turned, walked straight to the stage, and picked up the microphone. The chatter dimmed. The band lowered their volume. Everyone turned toward her. My heart pounded again, but this time it wasn't from shock. It was from anticipation. And maybe a little fear. Mom stood beneath the hanging lights, framed by the warm glow of candles. Her navy dress shimmered with each breath of wind. She looked beautiful, composed, completely in control. Good evening, everyone, she began, her voice clear and even. Thank you for being here tonight. For celebrating 30 years of partnership. The way she paused on that word made a few people exchange looks, but she didn't flinch. She smiled, eyes drifting briefly toward the bar, toward Dad and Susan, who had just stepped apart, pale as ghosts. 30 years, she continued. That's 3 decades of love, laughter, and lessons. Some lessons take a lifetime to learn. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Dad straightened his tie and tried to smile, but his face was stiff. Mom went on, her tone never rising, never trembling. When I was 24, I believed marriage was about trust. When I was 34, I believed it was about forgiveness. And now, at 50, she paused, sipped her wine. I've learned it's about courage. The courage to look at the truth, and still stand tall. The crowd murmured softly. Someone clapped politely, unsure what was happening. Mom laughed lightly. Not bitter, not mocking, just serene. I'd like to toast, she said. To honesty, to friendship, and to the people who remind us that loyalty is not measured by years, but by integrity. I glanced at Susan. Her hand trembled around her glass. Dad stared straight ahead, face flushed, jaw tight. Mom raised her glass higher. To the truth. May it never hide for too long. And with that, she drank. The guests followed hesitantly, their confused smiles blending into whispers. When the applause faded, she handed the microphone to the band leader, as if nothing unusual had been said, and returned to her seat beside me. I leaned in, Mom, how long have you known? She looked at me, her eyes soft, but sharp. Long enough, she said quietly. Then, after a pause, you can't rush a confession, sweetheart. You have to let people reveal themselves. It's more satisfying that way. I sat there, trying to comprehend her composure. The woman who'd spent years cooking dinners, hosting book clubs, volunteering at church. She wasn't the naive housewife I'd assumed she was. There was a steel under that calm. Dad tried to pull her aside later, muttering something about misunderstandings and too much champagne. Mom just smiled, patted his hand, and said, "Relax, dear. The best part's still coming." That line echoed in my head all night. I didn't yet know what she meant, but as I watched her move gracefully through the crowd, laughing with guests, thanking the caterer, pretending everything was fine, I realized something. Mom wasn't breaking down. She was setting the stage, and deep down, I knew whatever came next, she was ready for it. By the next morning, every woman who'd attended that party was already calling each other. I know, because my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Did your mom mean what I think she meant? Was that about your dad? Is Susan okay? She left early, didn't she? I ignored them all. I didn't know what to say, because honestly, I didn't know what had just happened. That night, Mom's toast had landed like a quiet bomb. There was no yelling, no scene, no public fight. Just one speech, elegant and calm, that left a room full of adults, looking at each other with polite smiles and sweaty palms. Dad hadn't said a word afterward. He'd clinked a few glasses, pretended to laugh, and slipped away to his office before dessert. Susan had vanished so quickly that her half-full martini was still sitting on the bar when I went to clean up. Mom, on the other hand, stayed until the last guest left. She thanked the caterers, hugged neighbors, and even sent the band home with leftovers. She looked radiant, lighter somehow, like a woman who'd finally set something down. I remember sitting on the back porch while she stacked plates into boxes. The glow from the string lights flickered against her face, and for the first time, I saw it. That quiet power. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't beg. It simply waits for the truth to walk itself out. "Mom," I finally said, "you knew, didn't you?" She smiled, not at me, but at the moon. "Sweetheart, a woman knows the difference between silence and secrets." I didn't know what that meant at the time, but I do now. When she finally sat beside me, her shoulders relaxed for the first time all night. "You saw them, didn't you?" she asked softly. I nodded, behind the bar. Her lips pressed together, not in pain, but in acknowledgement. "I thought so," she murmured. "That's his favorite hiding spot. He thinks it makes him less visible." There was no bitterness in her voice, just weariness. She sipped the last of her champagne and set the glass down gently. "You know," she said, "when a man cheats, he doesn't just betray his wife. He betrays the version of himself she used to believe in." That line stayed with me for years. The next morning, I expected a storm. Yelling, crying, slammed doors. But when I came downstairs, the smell of coffee filled the kitchen. Mom was already dressed, hair brushed, humming quietly while flipping pancakes. Dad sat at the table, staring at his phone, jaw clenched. "Morning," she said cheerfully, as if nothing had happened. He didn't answer. I poured myself coffee and tried to pretend the air wasn't heavy with tension. Finally, Dad looked up. "You embarrassed me last night." Mom didn't even blink. "Did I she asked softly. "I thought you did that yourself." He went pale. "This isn't funny." "Nothing about it is," she replied, turning the pancake. I caught the faintest smirk, tugging at her lips. She wasn't being cruel. She was in control. He stood up. "You could have talked to me privately." She turned, spatula in hand, eyes calm. "Oh, trust me," she said. "There will be plenty of private talking." Then she flipped the pancake. "But first, I wanted to thank Susan publicly. It felt appropriate." He stormed out without another word. Mom exhaled slowly, and sat across from me. "Your father's not a bad man," she said, stirring her coffee. "He's just a man who thought no one was watching." "Are you going to divorce him?" I asked. Her smile returned, soft and strange. "Maybe, maybe not. Let's see what he does next." It struck me then. She wasn't driven by revenge. She was waiting for truth to show its full face. And somehow, I respected that more than anger. Later that day, Mom went out. Said she had errands. She came home with 2 envelopes, and a look of quiet determination. When I asked, she only said, paperwork. That night, Dad pretended everything was fine. He poured himself whiskey, watched baseball, and didn't mention the party once. But the tension in the house felt like a balloon about to burst. Around 10 p.m., I went to say goodnight. I heard his office door slightly ajar. He was on the phone, whispering. She doesn't suspect anything, he said. We'll talk tomorrow. Same place. My stomach turned. I didn't know who he was talking to, but I could guess. When I told Mom the next morning, she didn't react. She just said, that's perfect. Perfect. I repeated. Yes, she said. Because this time, I'll make sure there's someone else listening. That night, I followed her instructions. She told me to stay calm, to act normal, to let the truth come out naturally. We went to church the next morning, like nothing was wrong. We smiled through hymns and shook hands. With the same people who'd been whispering about our family all week. But I noticed something. Mom had changed. She was lighter. She was finally herself. That afternoon, she sat with me on the porch again. The autumn wind brushing through the trees. Sweetheart, she said quietly, sometimes the best revenge isn't making someone pay. It's making them watch you live well, after they expected you to fall apart. I didn't understand it fully then. I just nodded. That evening, while Dad took another work call, Mom began packing up her jewelry, old letters, and photos. When I asked why, she said, because when the truth walks in, I'd like to be ready to walk out. And just like that, I knew the best part hadn't come yet, but it was coming. She was preparing for it. And this time, she wasn't the one being betrayed. She was the one writing the ending. By Monday morning, the house had gone strangely quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels loaded, like air right before a thunderstorm. Mom moved through the kitchen, in her usual rhythm. Coffee brewing, news murmuring, sunlight streaking through the curtains. But there was a new steadiness in her movements. She was composed in a way that almost scared me. Dad sat at the table, pretending to read emails, spooning sugar into his coffee as if nothing in the world had shifted. He'd put on the same cologne he wore every day, the one Mom used to buy for him on Father's Day. Only this morning, she didn't look at him. I took my mug and sat down, careful not to make a sound. Morning, he muttered, without glancing up. Morning, Mom said evenly, flipping a page of the newspaper. Big week ahead, he said. She froze. Just for a second. Yeah, he said finally, voice stiff. Lot of meetings. Of course, she replied, without even pretending to believe it. The silence that followed was brutal. You could have cut it with a butter knife. Then, casually, Mom folded the paper and said, by the way, I talked to Linda at the bank. She said you were moving funds for the business. Something about an expansion. His spoon clinked against the cup. It's nothing, he said too quickly. Just a short-term adjustment. She smiled slightly, eyes still on the paper. Of course. Short-term. Adjustments have a way of turning permanent when no one's paying attention. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from gasping. Mom had just drawn blood with perfect politeness. Dad stood abruptly, grabbed his jacket, and said, I'll be late tonight. Mom looked up, her face calm, but her eyes razor sharp. That's fine, she said. Take your time. You always do. He left without another word. The front door closed with a dull thud. When I turned to her, she was already smiling faintly. He's going to meet her, she said softly, as if announcing the weather. I swallowed hard. Mom, are you sure you want to? She raised a hand gently. Sweetheart, I don't chase storms. I let them come to me. That evening, I watched her prepare for whatever she was planning. She wasn't pacing or crying or breaking things. She was ironing a pale blue blouse, doing her nails, and humming softly. It was eerie. Like watching someone get ready for a ceremony, only they understood. At 6, she called me into the kitchen. Do you remember how to work your phone's voice recorder? I blinked. Yeah. Good, she said. You'll need it tomorrow. Tomorrow, she smiled mysteriously. I'm going to stop being quiet. That night, she went to bed early. Dad never came home. The next morning, she woke up before dawn, made coffee, and stood at the sink watching the first light rise through the blinds. When she finally turned to me, her voice was calm but steady. I spent 30 years loving a man who thought loyalty was a hobby, she said. Now he gets to learn what devotion looks like when it's gone. She slipped her wedding ring off, and placed it on the counter. The sound it made, a soft metallic click, felt like thunder. Later that afternoon, I followed her into town. She said she had an errand, but her direction wasn't toward the grocery store or the bank. It was toward the firm where Susan's husband worked. When we walked in, the receptionist smiled. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Clark. He's expecting you." Mom had made an appointment. We waited in a sleek office until Susan's husband, Mark, came out. He looked surprised to see me, but not at all surprised to see Mom. That's when I realized they'd spoken before. He closed the door gently and offered coffee. Mom declined. She opened her purse and placed 2 photographs on his desk. They were from the party. Dad and Susan, behind the bar, captured in a reflection from the glass door. The kiss was unmistakable. Mark exhaled slowly, then sat down. "So," he said quietly, "it's true." Mom nodded. "It is. I thought you should see it before the town does." He looked at her, studying her face. "You're remarkably calm." She smiled faintly. "I find calm works better than chaos. Besides," she said, sliding him a small USB drive, "you'll want to hear what's on this." I stared, stunned. She'd recorded them. When he accepted it silently, for a moment the room was still. To betrayed people, sharing a kind of wordless understanding. Then he said softly, "What do you want from me, Mrs. Clark?" She stood. "Nothing," she said. "But when the truth comes out, I want you to know it wasn't my storm." I just stopped holding the umbrella. We left the office without another word. That night, Mom cooked dinner like it was any other Tuesday. Dad came home around 9, smelling of cheap perfume and guilt. He tried to kiss her cheek. She turned her face away politely, as if avoiding a sneeze. "Long day?" she asked mildly. He nodded. "Meetings ran late." "Of course," she said. "How's Susan?" His fork froze halfway to his mouth. "What?" I said. She repeated. "How's Susan? You know, your business consultant, your friend, your mistake." He dropped the fork. "You've lost your mind." "No," she said softly. "I've just stopped pretending." The room was silent, except for the clock ticking over the fridge. Then she leaned forward slightly, her voice low. "You should get some rest, dear. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." When he went upstairs, she turned to me and said, almost cheerfully, "Would you mind picking up donuts in the morning? I think we'll have company." I didn't ask who. I didn't have to. She already knew. That was the night I realized my mother didn't plan revenge, like other people. She planned closure. The next day didn't feel like morning. It felt like the moment right before lightning hits a tree. That thick, breathless air, when you know something irreversible is about to happen. Mom was already awake when I came downstairs, dressed neatly in her gray slacks and a crisp white blouse. She looked more like she was going to a board meeting than facing the fallout of a 30-year marriage. "Coffee's ready," she said, her tone as calm as a weather report. "And grab the donut box before you sit. They'll be here soon." I asked. She only smiled. "You'll see." Dad came down a few minutes later, rubbing his eyes, pretending exhaustion. He wore the same suit as yesterday, the same one he'd worn to late meetings. His tie was wrinkled, his guilt, not so much. "Morning," he said flatly. Mom looked up from her tablet. "Morning. Sleep well?" "Not really. I imagine not." He poured coffee, not looking at her. The silence that followed felt like 2 people sitting at the edge of a cliff, both pretending they weren't the ones who dug it. Then came the knock on the door. Dad flinched. I swear I saw it, a quick nervous twitch across his shoulders. Mom set down her cup, smoothed her blouse, and said, "Perfect timing." When she opened the door, Mark, Susan's husband, stood there in a dark suit, holding a briefcase. He looked rested, polished, dangerous in that quiet lawyer way. "Morning, Mrs. Clark," he said. As discussed, Dad's mug hit the table hard enough to spill coffee across the wood. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. Mom's smile didn't waver. "Mark and I have some paperwork to go over. I thought it'd be easier to do it here." "Paperwork? You went to him?" She turned, her eyes soft but firm. "Oh, don't sound surprised. You went to his wife." For a full 5 seconds, no one breathed. Then she gestured politely. "Sit down, both of you." Mark opened the briefcase and placed 2 folders on the table. "Mrs. Clark and I have been coordinating a few things. Joint property interests, investment statements. Given recent events, It's best if we clarify ownership before matters get messy. Dad looked from one to the other, completely thrown. You're serious? Completely, Mom said, sipping her coffee. I sat quietly, my heart racing. It felt like watching a chess game where one player hadn't realized he'd already lost. Mark slid one folder toward Dad. This is a copy of the recording. You might want to destroy it before anyone else hears it, but don't bother. My attorney already has the original. Dad's face went white. You can't. I can, Mark said evenly. And I will, if necessary. I suggest you read the agreement your wife drafted. It's very generous, considering. Mom's voice was gentle, almost kind. All I want, Richard, is transparency. You can have your accounts, your car, even your reputation, if you're careful. I just want my share and my peace. He didn't move. He just stared at her, like she was someone he'd never met. You planned this, he whispered. She tilted her head slightly. No. You planned it. I just finally stopped cleaning up your mess. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Mark packed his briefcase, and nodded at Mom. You're all set. Call me if he gets dramatic. Always a pleasure, she replied smoothly. After the door closed, Dad sank into a chair. You humiliated me, he said hoarsely. No, Richard, Mom said quietly. You did that yourself. I just gave you a microphone. He looked up sharply, his eyes wet with anger. You think this makes you strong? Mom stood, collected the signed papers, and said, No. It makes me free. She walked out of the kitchen without looking back. That night, I found her on the porch, sitting with a glass of white wine, the documents stacked neatly beside her. The evening air smelled of rain. Was that the plan all along? I asked softly. She looked at me, her face calm. No. The plan was to survive with grace. The rest came naturally. We sat together, listening to crickets in the yard. The porch light flickered against the dark. And for the first time, I noticed how still she looked. Not hollowed out. Not bitter. Just steady. After a while, she said quietly, Do you remember when you were little? And I told you never to chase someone who walks away. I nodded. Well, she said, eyes fixed on the rain beginning to fall. I should have listened to my own advice sooner. The next morning, she didn't make coffee for Dad. She didn't leave his lunch in the fridge. She simply handed him a stack of envelopes, bank notices, lawyer letters, and one handwritten note. He opened it silently. It said, You may keep the house, but not my silence. He looked up, searching for emotion in her face, but there was nothing left to find. Mom turned to me, kissed my forehead, and whispered, Sometimes, sweetheart, peace comes disguised as loss. Don't be afraid to open the door when it knocks. Then she picked up her keys and walked out. Not in anger, not in haste, just with the quiet dignity of a woman who knew she'd already won. And I sat there, watching the door swing closed, realizing that the woman I called Mom wasn't broken at all. She was reborn. It had been a week since Mom walked out of the house, and every day felt like the air was learning how to breathe again. The rooms were quieter, yes, but not empty. They were lighter. Dad tried to fill the silence with noise. The TV too loud, the phone ringing constantly, his shoes echoing through the hallways, as if pretending to sound busy could erase the echo of her calm. But guilt has a way of making a man smaller. I visited Mom every day at her new place. A modest rental on the edge of town, with a porch full of blooming hydrangeas, and sunlight spilling through the curtains. It wasn't big or fancy, but it felt alive. She looked younger already, freer. She started painting again. Small watercolors, of bluebirds, of morning light, of anything that looked like peace. You know, she said one afternoon as I brought her groceries, when you stop waiting for someone to change, your whole world gets quiet. I smiled weakly. You always make it sound easy. She shook her head. It wasn't, but sometimes quiet is the loudest kind of victory. Meanwhile, Dad was unraveling. The firm he worked for had started asking questions about inappropriate relationships with clients. The whispers were out. The very people who once toasted him at the anniversary party now avoided his calls. He blamed Mom for all of it. Of course he did. He came to see her on a rainy Friday afternoon, uninvited. I was there, helping her unpack dishes, when she opened the door and saw him standing there. Soaked in his expensive suit, she didn't even flinch. Richard, she said calmly, you're dripping on my welcome mat. He didn't smile. We need to talk. She stepped aside, but didn't offer him a seat. What about? You ruined me, he said, his voice cracking with anger. You and that smug lawyer. You think I don't know what you did. She crossed her arms, completely unfazed. I think you did that yourself. But if it helps, you can keep pretending I had help. He glared. Do you know how much I've lost? Yes, she said softly. Roughly as much as I did 10 years ago when I found your first love letter from her. He froze. You knew. Of course, she said. Women always know. We just wait for proof kind enough to show itself. He looked at me then, perhaps hoping I'd defend him. I didn't. I just stood there, silent, realizing for the first time that I didn't pity him anymore. Then Mom's phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up, read a message, and said, "Ah, that must be it." He frowned. What? The dinner, she said simply. She put on her gray coat, grabbed her purse, and motioned for me to follow. Where are you going? He asked. She smiled faintly. You'll see soon enough. The dinner was a charity banquet downtown. One she and Dad had both helped organize months earlier. Before everything fell apart, it was a big event. Local politicians, board members, sponsors, all dressed in black and silver. The same people who'd been at the anniversary party were here too. When we arrived, Mom looked radiant, poised, calm, and perfectly unbothered. She wore a simple black dress and carried herself like a woman who had nothing left to prove. Dad was already there, standing near the stage, talking nervously with Susan. Yes, Susan was back. Her face looked tighter, like she hadn't slept in days. When Mom walked in, every head turned. She smiled politely, greeted people by name, and accepted compliments as if nothing at all had happened. I followed her closely, my chest tight. I could tell something was about to unfold. The host welcomed everyone, thanked the donors, and then, as part of the evening program, announced, before we continue, Mrs. Elizabeth Clark has asked to say a few words. The crowd applauded warmly. Dad's face went pale. Susan stiffened. Mom walked up to the microphone, her heels steady on the marble floor. She took a breath, smiled at the audience, and began. Good evening. I wasn't sure I'd be here tonight. It's been quite a year. But I believe when you've given 30 years to something, you should at least show up for the finale. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Nervous, unsure, she continued. Marriage, as it turns out, is a lot like this event. You show up, you give what you can, and sometimes you realize the people beside you were only here for the buffet. The laughter died. You could have heard a pin drop. But the beautiful thing about truth, she said softly, is that it never hides forever. It just waits for the right moment to step into the light. She nodded to someone near the sound booth. And suddenly the room filled with a familiar voice. My father's. I can't wait till she's asleep. Meet me behind the bar again. Gasps. The sound of cutlery falling. Someone whispered, oh my God. Dad's face drained of color. Susan's eyes filled with tears. Mom didn't even blink. She let the message finish, then smiled gently. I didn't plan to humiliate anyone, she said. I just wanted to remind us all. Truth may take its time, but it always RSVP. Then she set the microphone down and walked off the stage to thunderous silence. I followed her through the ballroom, past the staring faces, past my father's stunned expression. When we reached the exit, she whispered to me, that, sweetheart, was the best part. And I finally understood what she meant all along. For a while, no one said a word about what happened at that dinner. But in a small town, silence travels faster than sound. Within 48 hours, everyone knew. The clip from that night made its way into a few cell phones, a few group chats, and eventually the local grapevine that never sleeps. It wasn't scandal in the Hollywood sense. It was the kind that spread through grocery aisles and church pop. People didn't shout, they whispered. And they all said the same thing. Did you hear what she did? She did it with class. Mom became a kind of quiet legend. The woman who exposed the truth without losing her grace. Dad, on the other hand, shrank into the shadows he'd built for himself. The law firm suspended him pending internal review. His friends stopped calling. The golf buddies, who once toasted him, now turned away. He moved out of the big house and into a condo on the edge of town. I visited once. It smelled of dust and whiskey. He still wore his wedding ring. Your mother humiliated me, he muttered. I shook my head. No, Dad, you did that when you forgot who was watching. He looked up, eyes bloodshot. Do you hate me? I didn't know what to say. I don't hate you, I finally whispered. I just don't recognize you. Mom never said a cruel word about him in public. When people asked, she simply said, we're both learning different kinds of peace. Was her way. Never petty, never vengeful, just finished. She kept busy. She volunteered at the community center, started teaching watercolor classes for retired teachers, and donated part of her settlement to a local women's scholarship fund. When I dropped by one evening, she was sitting on the porch, surrounded by her paintings, soft blues, gentle pinks, scenes of calm water and light. Mom, I said, how do you stay so calm after everything? She smiled, eyes tracing the horizon. Because anger ages you, sweetheart, but peace keeps you young. I laughed softly. You sound like a preacher. She shrugged. Maybe I'm just someone who finally stopped living for applause. Later that week, I helped her box up old photos from the house. We found one of her and Dad on their wedding day. 2 kids, barely older than I am now, smiling like the world would always be kind. She stared at it for a long time, then placed it carefully in a folder labeled what was. He wasn't all bad, she said quietly, just human. I forgave him a long time ago. He just didn't know it yet. That Sunday, Dad showed up unannounced. I answered the door. He looked thinner, older, his pride worn down to something fragile. Is she home? He asked. Mom appeared behind me, holding a towel. She'd been painting again. Hello, Richard, she said gently. He cleared his throat. I wanted to apologize. I don't expect forgiveness. I just. She interrupted softly. Forgiveness isn't for you. It's for me. But thank you for saying it. He blinked, unsure how to respond. She gestured toward the porch. Would you like some tea? And just like that, they sat together. 2 people who had burned down a house, but were learning to stand among the ashes, without pointing fingers. They talked for nearly an hour. About the garden, about me, about how the town still gossiped, but would soon move on. When he left, he turned to her and said, you always deserved better than me. She smiled faintly. Maybe. But you were my lesson. And lessons are priceless. After he left, she exhaled deeply, the kind of sigh that sounds like closure. I sat beside her, and she reached for my hand. You know, she said, for years I thought being a good wife meant holding everything together. But sometimes being strong means letting things fall apart gracefully. That night, I saw her take off her wedding ring and slip it into a small velvet box. She placed it beside a new canvas, one she'd been working on all week. It was a painting of a shoreline after a storm. Broken branches, scattered shells, and one small patch of sunlight breaking through gray clouds. The next day, she mailed the ring to a local jeweler, with a note. Melt it. Make something new. Weeks passed. Dad quietly sold his share of the company. Susan and her husband moved to Florida, far away from the echoes of their choices. Life began to settle, but the quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was honest. One evening, as we sipped tea on her porch, I asked, do you miss him? Mom smiled softly. Sometimes, but missing someone isn't the same as wanting them back. I miss who we were before we forgot what respect sounded like. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. She leaned back, watching the sky shift from orange to deep blue. You know what the funny part is? She said. If he'd just told me the truth years ago, I might have forgiven him then. But by hiding it, he gave me time to become someone who didn't need him anymore. That line hit me like a sermon. When I left that night, she handed me a newly forged pendant, made from her old ring, a small gold feather. For you, she said, to remind you that sometimes letting go isn't weakness, it's flight. And that was the last time we talked about Dad. Not because we forgot, but because we didn't need to remember in pain anymore. The truth had finally done its job. 6 months later, spring came early. The trees bloomed before the forecast said they would. And the light seemed softer somehow. The kind of light that feels like forgiveness. Mom had moved into a small cottage by the lake, about 20 minutes from town. It wasn't fancy. 2 bedrooms, white curtains, a front porch that creaked when the wind picked up. But it was hers. Every inch of it smelled like fresh paint, lavender candles, and second chances. When I pulled up one Sunday morning, she was already in the garden, wearing an old sun hat and humming to herself as she planted herbs. She looked peaceful. Not in a fragile way, but in that deep, grounded way that only comes after surviving a storm. "Morning, sweetheart," she called. "Grab the basket. The tomatoes are finally turning red." I smiled, stepping out of the car. "You're glowing." She wiped her hands on her apron and laughed. "Freedom's good for the skin." We sat on the porch with lemonade, watching the water shimmer in the distance. I'd brought mail from the old house, mostly bills and magazines, but among them was an envelope addressed in Dad's handwriting. Mom saw it immediately. Her smile didn't fade, but her voice lowered a little. "Ah, I wondered when that would come. Do you want me to open it?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, darling. I'll open it when I'm ready to read it." But after a long pause, she did open it. The letter inside was short. Just 2 pages, written in his careful script. He apologized for the lies, the pride, the way he'd let her carry their marriage alone while he chased his own validation. He said he'd moved to a quiet town in Maine, near the coast, and spent his mornings fishing, thinking about how easily a man can lose what matters most. Mom read every word slowly. When she finished, she folded the paper, set it on the table, and stared out toward the lake for a long time. Finally, she said softly, "It's strange. I waited years to hear him say sorry, but now that he has, it doesn't change a thing. I forgave him before he even knew he needed it." She reached for her lemonade, smiling faintly. "That's the gift of surviving betrayal, sweetheart. You realize, peace isn't something he gives back. It's something you take back." We sat in silence for a while. The wind carried the smell of honeysuckle and wet earth. Somewhere across the lake, a child was laughing. I asked quietly, "Do you think he still loves you?" Her answer came like a sigh. "Maybe. But love without respect isn't love. It's nostalgia." I didn't know what to say, so I just took her hand. She squeezed gently. "Don't let what happened to us make you afraid to love, okay? Just promise me one thing. When you meet someone, make sure they see you, not what they want to see. And if they ever stop seeing you, walk away before you start disappearing." I nodded, my throat tight. She smiled, then leaned back in her chair. "You know, I used to think the best part of my life ended when he betrayed me. But now I see. That was just the intermission." That line hit me so deeply I had to look away. Later that evening, we took a walk along the lake. The sky was painted gold and violet, and the water glimmered like glass. She stopped to skip a pebble across the surface. It bounced 3 times before sinking. "Not bad for 54, she said with a grin. I laughed. "You're unstoppable." She smiled again, quieter this time. "No, sweetheart. I'm just finally at peace with stopping." When we got back to the cottage, she hung her old wedding photo on the wall. Not in bitterness, but as a reminder of everything she'd learned. Under it, she placed the small gold feather pendant, the one forged from her wedding ring. I looked at it and said, "It's beautiful." She nodded. "It's lighter now." That night, before I left, she hugged me tightly. The kind of hug that feels like a promise. "Tell your story someday," she whispered. "Not for revenge. For understanding. People need to know that endings don't have to destroy you. Sometimes they build you." I promised I would. Driving home, I couldn't stop replaying that moment. The anniversary, the microphone, the calm in her eyes as she whispered, "The best part's coming." Back then, I thought she meant the reveal. The truth, the scandal. Now I know she meant this. The peace, the healing, the quiet dignity that comes when you finally stop fighting for someone else's reflection and start honoring your own. If you're listening to this and you've ever been betrayed, lied to, or made to feel small, remember, you can lose everything except your honor. And when you hold on to that, the rest will rebuild itself in time. Because the best part is always still coming. So take a breath, hold your head high, and if this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to remember what grace looks like when it finally wins.